Let's talk about project resource scheduling. Here's the agenda for this lesson. First, we'll talk about some of the key terms. Then we'll get into the generic life cycle of scheduling just to help paint a picture. Then we'll discuss some of the new features that have been implemented with the latest version here. And finally, we'll have two demonstrations on how you can resource schedule. So with that being said, let's get started. All right, let's talk about some key terms when it comes to project resource scheduling. The first one is a resource. A resource can be an employee or a contractor that is going to fill a role on a project. The other way that you can look at it is if there hasn't been an actual person assigned to as a resource, you can think of a resource as a role on a project as well. So you can just say a resource is going to be a project manager. All right, so that kind of brings us to the next term, which is a role, and a role is a role on a project. So basically you can think of that as like a project manager, a consultant, a developer. It's basically a role, and you can define characteristics around that role. So then we have the term booked, and booked is basically when you assign a role to a project, you can reserve the time and the number of hours per day that you want that role to work on the project. So if there's nobody assigned to it and you're just reserving time, that's considered booked hours. So when you have the assigned hours is basically when you have assigned that role or the specific resource to a task in the WBS. So basically when we look at the all projects list page, there's going to be two columns, booked and assigned. So booked is just basically when a role or whoever, role is reserved to the project, while assigned means that you've actually assigned that specific person or role to tasks. Fulfill, so you can take that role, you can assign the length of time you need them and the number of hours, and then you can assign a resource to that role, and when you assign that resource to the role, you're fulfilling that resource. So that's one of the terms you'll hear. And then we have the resource calendar. A resource calendar in AX is basically a calendar of days, and then you can define the days as open or closed, and then you can say what are the working hours for that day. You can assign a resource calendar at the project level to basically say when that project is open and closed and what hours are working hours, and you can assign it to a resource as well. So it's just basically a term that you're going to hear, and you can just think of it as days that are open and closed and the number of hours they work those on a working day. So competencies as well. These are associated with resources and roles. So you can assign competencies to a resource, which basically are their skills or characteristics about that resource, and you can assign them to roles as well if you have characteristics about that role that you're looking for. So there's actually functionality where you can find the appropriate resource based on the competencies that you set up. So those are the key terms that I just wanted to briefly talk about. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the life cycle of a project. I shouldn't say a project, resource scheduling of a project. Let's briefly talk about the resource scheduling lifecycle, and the first thing to note is there's multiple ways to resource schedule in Dynamics AX, but I'll walk you through one of the tracks to resource scheduling. So the first thing you need to do any sort of project resource scheduling is have a project. Once you have that project, you can define roles. And when you define your roles, you're defining a couple things. You're saying what the role is, how long you'll need that role, and the number of hours per day you'll need the role to be allocated to the project. When you define your roles inside of Dynamics AX, you actually have competencies that you can define about that role, so the different characteristics of the role. So then when we go to fulfill the resource, or basically assign a resource to that role, you need a resource, and then B, that resource actually has competencies. So you can see if you follow the train or the lines, the resource has competencies, and then the competencies are connected to the role. So you'll find the appropriate resource. You also have to take into account capacity. So that resource needs to have the applicable or the right amount of capacity in order to fulfill that role as well. So if we look at that competencies node, there's different types of competencies in here. You can define skills, a role could be considered a competency, certifications, education. And once again, you can define those competencies at 2 levels, the role level or the resource level. There's one other one that we should mention too. You can look for resources that have worked on specific projects as well. Didn't throw that in there, but that's another searchable criteria. And if you think about defining your roles and fulfilling the resource, that's what we call building a team inside of Dynamics AX. So just wanted to call that out. And then once you have fulfilled your resources, you can actually assign them to work. When you hear that term as well, assigning to work basically means taking any of your team members and assigning them to a specific task in the WBS. That's not a required step, but just something that you can do. All right, so that's a quick look at the life cycle of a project. Let's talk about some of the features, specifically the new features as of Dynamics AX, the RTW release. So first of all, there's 4 different buckets that we can look at. There's visual resource scheduling, staffing projects, flexible resource capacity allocation, reports and inquiries. So anything that you're seeing on the screen that's in bold are some of the new features that are implemented as of RTW. So if we look at the visual resource scheduling, so now you can identify planned resources and fulfill them. So what that means is basically when we go in and we define a role and you say that, hey, you need 2 project managers, well, now it creates project manager 1 and project manager 2, which it didn't do that in the past. And then when you have those project manager 1 and project manager 2, you can define the length of time you need them and the number of hours you need them as well. So they're sitting out there as a resource even though you haven't defined a specific employee or contractor to fulfill that role. So it's new functionality. We'll take a look at that shortly. Staffing projects, very cool piece of functionality that's going to pay great dividends in the future. If you're familiar with the manufacturing scheduling, well, now project scheduling actually uses the same framework. So in the future, you're going to be able to schedule machines and anything else that the manufacturing scheduling does. As of the RTW, you can use human resources still. That's the only piece of functionality, but look for that to be expanded, and just note that when you create a resource, it's going in the system as an operational resource rather than just a project-specific resource, which is just setting the ground for future enhancement. Role-based pricing. So you can create roles and then define prices. We touched on that in the pricing course, or the sales price and cost price course. Auto-generate project team. So when you create a work breakdown structure, basically you can say what roles are required on each task, and then there's an auto-generate button, and it'll basically build your team and create those roles. Like I was mentioning around the project manager, you can have project manager 1, project manager 2, and it will just define those and the appropriate dates and capacity that you need on a specific date. The rest of the functionality is pretty similar to what it was in the past, and I'll just let you take a look at all the different features. We'll just highlight a couple of them. For the flexible resource capacity allocation, there's still the same way to book resources. You can book their full capacity, a specific number of hours, remaining capacity, or a % of their capacity. There's still soft and hard booking, where soft is basically geared around project quotations where the work isn't for sure, and you just want to have resources, some kind of signal within the resource list that person is potentially allocated to a project. Hard booking is basically saying that they are on a project or booked to a specific project or to specific tasks. And then we have quite a few reports and inquiries. We'll touch on some of the resource utilization inquiries, so you're familiar with those. And then there's just the other ways to report on it as well. So these are just a few of the features I just briefly wanted to touch on and call out some of the new RTW functionality.